Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Geekery 101, the show on this channel where we just give you some quick recommendations and explanations on how to start your new geeky obsession. And after this weekend, I'm sure a lot of you are now really interested to learn more about the Defenders. That's right, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist, and Daredevil all came together in their own Netflix series, The Defenders, and many of you probably want to read more about this team or more about the individual characters. So today on Geekery 101, I am going to give you a couple of quick recommendations on where you can start reading about these characters. Now, before I continue, I want to go ahead and make one thing very clear. I'm going to avoid all spoilers in this show and just talk about where to start reading these characters. However, when it comes to Daredevil, I'm going to make one recommendation that could be seen maybe kinda sorta as a slight spoiler. So if you have not finished this show just yet and you don't want to risk it, then I will save Daredevil for the end of this episode, and when we get to that character, tune out then. But let's go ahead and start talking about the Defenders themselves. Now, if you want to read about this actual team made up of these characters and other street-level heroes in the Marvel Universe, there is one thing that I need to make clear. I am sure that many of you are going to go into your local comic book store, find just a random copy of an old Defenders issue, and think, here we go, I'll start with this. Slow down. The Defenders did not become the characters that you know until very recently. I am talking about within the last year. Before that, the Defenders was a very different team. Now, one thing that it did share in common with the current incarnation is that it was made up more of loners. It was made up more of characters who didn't really fit in with other teams, so they decided to just get together to watch each other's back. However, whereas today the loners in the Marvel Universe are Daredevil, Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and Jessica Jones, back then when the team was created, the loners who created this team were the Hulk, Doctor Strange, Silver Surfer, the Submariner, some of the biggest powerhouses and cosmic level heroes in the Marvel Universe. And yes, there were indeed many good stories with these characters. However, if you wanted to read about this and went into your local comic book store and you came back with this, you would be very confused. So if you want to read about these guys, the place to start is actually with the current Defender series, which is only on issue 4. Normally when I give you recommendations about comics to pick up, I tell you to pick up a trade, because that way you get a whole storyline collected together in one book. However, this series is so new, it actually doesn't even have a trade yet. A full storyline is not complete with this series just yet. So go to your local comic book store and you can probably still find issue 1 somewhere in the bins. So go there, check it out, that is the place to start. So there you go, that was a real easy recommendation for the Defenders, simply because there is no other place to start reading about this particular team of the Defenders. Same thing can kind of be said for Jessica Jones, because even though she has been around since 2001, she has not had that many series. She first appeared in a series called Alias, and pretty much everything inside that series is what they got for the Jessica Jones television series. So if you like the Jessica Jones TV show and you want to read something similar to that, check out Jessica Jones Alias. The complete story is collected over the course of 4 different trades, and once you finish those trades, if you want to continue, her next adventure was in a series called The Pulse, which has also been collected in trades. However, I would be hesitant to recommend reading The Pulse, simply because while the Jessica Jones Alias series was very much its own thing, it almost existed within its own universe. In fact, there were some characters from the Marvel Universe that popped up in that book and would die in that book, and then they'd still be alive in the regular Marvel Universe. So a lot of people actually question, does this actually tie into anything? But as I said, this happened 16 years ago, so if you go back and read it now, you don't need to worry about continuity. You can read it just fine as its own standalone thing, and just read it as the origin of Jessica Jones, as where this character came from. However, in The Pulse, that storyline focused on Jessica Jones leaving her private eye business to become a reporter for the Daily Bugle, and at that time, The Pulse was firmly set within the Marvel Universe, meaning everything that was going on at that time in the Marvel Universe, they tend to talk about it in The Pulse. So after you finish Alias, if you really want to continue the adventures of Jessica Jones, well then go ahead, pick up the Pulse. Just be warned, you are kind of gonna be lost simply because they're going to talk a lot about stuff that was happening in Marvel Comics over a decade ago. However, if you want to start reading her most recent adventures, the creator of Jessica Jones and the one who wrote the Alias and the Pulse series, Brian Michael Bendis, recently returned to Jessica Jones to write her in a brand new series simply called Jessica Jones. Now, again, this series kind of walks that weird line of tying into the Marvel Universe but not tying into the Marvel Universe. It very much is firmly set in continuity. However, it still has its own tone. You are not going to see Jessica Jones crossing over into any big, giant, epic events. However, they are going to reference big, giant, epic events that recently happened in Marvel Comics. So if you are aware of the things currently going on at Marvel Comics, then fine, you can read Jessica Jones and you will be totally okay. However, if you don't really read any other Marvel books and you just want to read Jessica Jones, you can still read this series. It isn't as firmly set in continuity as The Pulse was. However, there will be a couple of things that you're going to have to stop and ask, wait, so what is this character doing here? What are they referencing here? But it's not to the extent where you can't still enjoy the book on its own. Now next up, moving on to Luke Cage, this one's going to be a bit more difficult because there's really 3 different incarnations of Luke Cage. The first one was back in the 70s when he was going by the name Power Man, Hero for Hire, and it was more of a 1970s blaxploitation kind of storyline, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to go back and read those storylines and kind of be disappointed with him simply because he does not match up with the version of Luke Cage that you have seen in the TV series at all. However, there is some kitschy charm to him after all these years. I mean, there are storylines in there where he had to go and beat up Dr. Doom because he hired him for a job and then refused to pay, so he went all the way to Latveria to get his cash. Yeah, there's some fun, goofy stuff like that that does still make it an enjoyable read. However, as I said, it's not the Luke Cage that you just saw in this TV series, so if that's what you want, that's not exactly where I'd recommend starting. Plus, in all honesty, none of those old storylines are still in print, so you would have to go online to find them. Now, the next incarnation of him came around the 90s when they tried to give him a resurgence, and this one was more of the street-level hero, the more realistic version of Luke Cage that you've come to know. However, it still was very superhero-y. It still was trying to capture that feeling of the old 70s comics, but at the same time trying to update them. But then again, an updated book in the 90s is still going to feel dated to you these days. So in all honesty, unless you just really want to read some Luke Cage stuff, I wouldn't even recommend picking up the 90s stuff. And that brings us to the current day and age where we find his most recent incarnation, but even that is going to be hard to pick a recommendation simply because he did not have his own ongoing series for a long time. For years, he did not have his own book, but he was in the Jessica Jones Alias series. If you watch the Jessica Jones show and you notice that Luke Cage first appeared in there, yeah, that's because he made a big comeback in the actual Jessica Jones Alias series. And from there, the writer Brian Michael Bendis actually picked him up and moved him over to the Avengers when he took over writing duty on that book. So if you read him in Jessica Jones and you want to see where he pops up next, it's in the Brian Michael Bendis New Avengers series, which recently just came back into print. But if you want my personal recommendation of where to start reading about this character, I would actually turn to the author David Walker. This guy took over writing duty on him when he relaunched the Power Man and Iron Fist series. Yes, if you watch Defenders and you kept noticing, wow, they're really trying to hint at a friendship between Iron Fist and Luke Cage, it's because in the Marvel Universe, they're the dynamic duo. They are two of the best buds in all of comic book history. They ran a crime-fighting team by themselves for a long time, for decades even. So they have always had each other's backs, they have been close friends, and they recently brought back the Power Man and Iron Fist series, and David Walker did a wonderful job of capturing that modern-day street-level hero tone to it. And the series only ran for about 17 issues, but when that was over with, they gave Luke Cage his own series, and it was still being written by David Walker. Walker. And this one is far more serious than the Power Man and Iron Fist series. It is more of a detective story. It's Luke Cage actually going around trying to solve crimes, kind of like he was in the TV series. So if you watch the TV series and you said that's the version of Luke that I want to read about, David Walker. Check out his current Luke Cage series, which currently is up to issue 4. Just like with the Defenders, it is not collected in a trade yet, but it is still new enough that you could go back and find all the issues at your local comic book store. And if you like that and you want to read more, and maybe even read a version of him that's a little bit more lighthearted and a little bit more fun, check out David Walker's Power Man and Iron Fist. And speaking of Iron Fist, there are a couple of places that you can start reading about his character. The number one spot that I would recommend checking out would be the Matt Fraction and Ed Brubaker Immortal Iron Fist series. This is a version of Iron Fist that it is very noir, but it's also kind of fun and upbeat. Ed Brubaker was always known for writing very gritty detective stories, and Matt Fraction was always known for capturing really quirky, fun characters, so the two of them working on a book together brought to the table the things that they both specialize in. And the storyline actually focused on Iron Fist returning to the mystical city of Kunlun to actually fight in a tournament where he had to be the representative of Kunlun, and the other mystical lost cities out there each brought their own champions to the table, and the other champions who get introduced in this series are fantastic. They are each really fun characters, and if you pick up these trades, it also includes the mini-series that they made about them, where every single character gets their own one-shot that really explains their history, and they each have marvelous histories. I personally myself really love the Fat Cobra one-shot by Jason Aaron, and if you pick up these trades, you can find that and so much more inside. I absolutely recommend starting here. However, they are kind of thick, and they are kind of expensive. So if you don't want to go in there and spend more than $30 on one Iron Fist storyline, and you want to just start with a single issue, well, as I said, you can go with the more recent adaptation of him that you could find in the Power Man and Iron Fist series, but I've already talked about that. But just like with Luke Cage, just like with Jessica Jones, Iron Fist himself recently got his own series. And just like in the Matt Fraction Ed Brubaker run, he is having to compete in a tournament with several other deadly martial artists. However, there is an interesting reason why he has to go and compete in this tournament. You see, the Matt Fraction Ed Brubaker series was not the last Iron Fist series before this one. There was another one in there in which the ancient city of Kunlun was actually destroyed, and he is now starting to sense that his powers are fading away without this city in existence. So he has to go and compete in this tournament against other people with dangerous forms of chi, and every time he wins, he gets a bit of their chi. So basically, he has to fight to replenish his powers. Again, while I myself personally do prefer the Immortal Iron Fist series and even the Power Man and Iron Fist series, this one is still darn good. In fact, if you're looking for something a little bit darker, a little bit more intense with the action, and just full of tons of crazy martial arts action, yeah, this is a great series to go with. And that brings me to the final member of the Defenders to talk about, Daredevil. Now, as I said, one of these recommendations will have a slight, maybe kind of sort of spoiler about the show, so I am going to save that book for last, and I will let you know when to tune out. But for now, there's several places that I always like to start with Daredevil, and it depends on how far back you want to go. Now, I've mentioned Brian Michael Bendis a couple times throughout this episode, and that's because he really does have a knack for capturing these street-level heroes, and I will be totally honest with you, there are many people who argue about who had the best run on Daredevil, and while I myself am debating between two different people, one of those people is Brian Michael Bendis. He actually came in and did a long-running storyline with this character that completely shook him up and changed him for decades to come. What Brian Michael Bendis did with this character is he had a random goon working underneath the Kingpin find out that the Kingpin actually has known for years who Daredevil secretly is. And after this thug learns who Daredevil is, he decides, well, why hasn't the Kingpin been doing anything with this? Why is he just holding on to this? And he then goes and he leaks that info out to the paper, so now the entire world knows that Matt Murdock is Daredevil. However, Matt Murdock isn't going to take this laying down, so he goes out there and he fights it. He goes out and says, guys, how on earth could I be Daredevil? I'm blind. Can you not figure this out? It makes no sense at all. How on earth could a blind lawyer be Daredevil? And about half the population goes, oh, of course, that makes total sense. The other half of the population goes, yeah, I'm not buying that just yet. I'm going to keep looking into this. So for the next couple years after this, it really does kind of set up an interesting new position for Daredevil, where now people kind of sort of are figuring out what his secret identity is, and that was just the start of all the crazy places that this storyline goes. I wouldn't dare spoil all the amazing places that the Brian Michael Bendis run on Daredevil ends up going. However, I will just say it is full of twists and turns, and there are legit moments in this run that actually made me gasp. I would totally recommend checking this out, and if you like it and you get all the way up to the end, it ends on a pretty massive cliffhanger. And these days in comics, most writers try to wrap everything up so that way the next writer can start off fresh. Brian Michael Bendis ended it on a massive cliffhanger and then turned to Ed Brubaker and went, good luck with that, and then just walked off. And then Ed Brubaker, who I mentioned specializes in crime noir storylines and actually helped write the Immortal Iron Fist series, he then came on board and just picked up that ball and ran with it. He continued to write amazing storylines with Daredevil that really played off everything that Brian Michael Bendis established, and he didn't go back and erase any of it. He kept building upon the storylines that he had already established. Now, as I said, I have a couple of different places that I like to recommend that people start with Daredevil, and if you don't want to go that far back, and you don't want to read something that dark with Daredevil, because believe me, those storylines got dark, then I would recommend starting with the Mark Waid Daredevil series. Now, as I said, Brian Michael Bendis started Daredevil down a very dark path, and Ed Brubaker took that ball and ran with it, and it all kind of came to a climax where Daredevil was at his absolute lowest, and now he was forced to pick himself back up and rebuild himself from the ground up. And Mark Waid came in here and said, guys, Daredevil has just been really sad for the past couple of years. He has had his life turned to crap. How about he just decides, you know what, I don't care anymore. Let's just have fun with this. I'm just going to go out there and be a superhero. And for the next couple of years, a lot of people describe the Mark Waid version of Daredevil as the Devil May Care Daredevil. He was a Daredevil who had fun with being Daredevil. The plot lines were not quite as intense. They were a lot more upbeat and more classic superhero style storylines, to a point. When I started reading the Mark Waid Daredevil series, everybody loved it right off the bat. I thought it was okay right off the bat. I thought, alright, it's fine. You're doing what you gotta do with the character because he did get too far down and he did get too dark. However, Mark Waid revealed, oh yeah, I was just taking my time. I was just letting all the dominoes set up. As this storyline goes along, you realize Mark Waid was taking his time setting every character where they needed to be, building up slow storylines that you were waiting to see play out, and then when they finally do play out, it is amazing. I said that Brian Michael Bendis, to me, is one of the two best writers on Daredevil. I think Mark Waid is the other one. Throughout this storyline, Mark Waid ended up bringing back old villains and reinterpreting them in fresh new ways, but he also ended up creating brand new villains for Daredevil, who in all honesty are some of my favorites. He created some of my absolute favorite Daredevil moments, and it involves some chilling villain interactions. Brian Michael Bendis knew how to get you invested with Daredevil and keep you on track for a long storyline. Mark Waid knew how to write a long storyline made up of a bunch of smaller storylines that kept you gasping with every single page that you turn. So, either one of these two guys would be my absolute recommendation of where to begin reading about this character. However, as I said, to me, personally, Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Waid wrote the two best versions of Daredevil. However, a lot of people out there would include a third writer, and to me, yeah, it's really hard to not include him up there with those two. For years, he was my #1 guy. It wasn't until Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Waid came along that I was like, I'm going to have to bump you down to #3. But he is still really up there, and for decades, he was considered the unchallenged king of writing Daredevil. I am talking about Frank Miller. Now, this brings me into my final recommendation, and if you do not want to hear this slight small spoiler, tune out now. But when it comes to Frank Miller, the recommendation that I would make would be to pick up Born Again. And the main reason I would recommend this is simply because it's a damn good storyline. As I mentioned with the Brian Michael Bendis series, it revolved heavily around the Kingpin knowing who Daredevil was. Born Again was the storyline where the Kingpin learned that to begin with, and he learned it by driving some of his closest friends crazy, and then after obtaining this information, he just spent years just tormenting Matt Murdock and slowly destroying every single part of his life until his entire home was in flames. It was one of the best tormented hero storylines I've ever read, and the reason why I bring this up is because if you watch Defenders all the way to the end, you know this is pretty much what Season 3 of Daredevil is going to be. Where Daredevil ends is exactly a scene from Born Again. So that is very likely going to be the next storyline, and I'm sure they're going to take some liberties. Like, for example, the villain Nuke was introduced in the Born Again storyline, but he popped up in the Jessica Jones series already, so they are probably going to use a different villain to fit in that role. Cough, cough. Just saying. But that's it. Those are my quick, simple recommendations on where to start reading about Daredevil, Iron Fist, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, and the Defenders. If you have your own personal recommendations, then make sure to leave them in the comments down below, and let me know what some of your favorite storylines involving these characters were. And if you want to start following us on Twitter, Twitch, and Tumblr, just look for @ProfessorThorgy. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. If you like this video, then make sure to share it around the web and give us a thumb up. It's the best way to help this channel grow. We thank you so much for doing that, and we hope that you come back next time. Bye, everyone.